The conference hall was huge and beautiful. It stood on Station Meridian, a space station that floated between the stars. The walls were made of shining metal, and holographic screens displayed information from all over the galaxy. Inside the hall, representatives from 47 different alien species sat in rows of seats that curved around a central platform. Some aliens were tall, others were short. Some had scales, others had fur. The variety was amazing, a true picture of how different life could be across the universe. Ambassador Henry Blake stood at the human section. He wore a simple gray suit that looked plain compared to the fancy robes and decorations that other diplomats wore. Henry was 53 years old with gray hair starting to show at his temples. His face had lines from years of hard work and tough negotiations, but his blue eyes were sharp and clear. He had spent 30 years working in diplomacy, talking to alien species, making deals, and trying to keep peace between humans and the rest of the galaxy. Standing next to Henry was Commander Lisa Martinez. She wore a military uniform with patches and medals that showed her rank in the Terran Defense Fleet. Lisa was 38 years old, with dark hair pulled back tight. Her brown eyes constantly moved around the room, watching for danger. Her hand stayed close to the weapon on her belt, even though weapons were supposed to be forbidden in this place. Lisa had been a soldier her whole adult life, and she knew that rules did not always stop bad people from doing bad things. The summit meeting had been going on for 3 days. The purpose was to talk about territory disputes in the Outer Rim, a region of space far from Earth. Human colonies had been spreading into areas that the galactic sovereignty claimed belonged to them. The sovereignty was an empire that had ruled most of the galaxy for 10,000 years. They had millions of ships, billions of soldiers, and technology that was very advanced. But they also had rules that many species found unfair and cruel. For 3 days, Henry had argued humanity's case. He spoke clearly and calmly, presenting evidence that the systems humans had colonized were empty before humans arrived. He showed old star maps and exploration records proving that humans had the right to be there. He talked about the families who had made their homes on these new worlds, the children who had been born there, the lives that people had built. But the sovereignty did not want to listen. At the center of their delegation sat High Chancellor Vexlar. He was from a species called the Dravix, and he was enormous. His body was covered in scales that reflected the light in rainbow patterns. He had 4 eyes that looked at Henry with obvious dislike. The Dravix had ruled the sovereignty for thousands of years, and they did not like it when younger species questioned their authority. On the 3rd day, things got worse. Henry stood up to give another speech. He spoke about fairness and justice. He reminded everyone that space was big enough for all species to have room. He pointed out that humans had always tried to be good neighbors, sharing technology and trading peacefully with other races. His words were respectful but firm. Humans would not give up their colonies just because the sovereignty demanded it. Chancellor Vexlar responded with anger. His voice came through the translation system, and every word dripped with contempt. He called humans primitive. He said humanity was too young to understand how the galaxy really worked. He suggested that humans should be grateful that the sovereignty even allowed them to exist. The insult was clear to everyone in the room. Henry's jaw tightened, but he kept his calm. He had dealt with insults before. He gathered his papers and data tablets, preparing to respond with another carefully prepared argument. Lisa stood beside him, but something felt wrong to her. Her military training made her sensitive to danger, and right now every instinct was screaming that something bad was about to happen. She noticed a small change in the air pressure readings on her wrist display. Then she saw a flicker of movement in the upper gallery, where observers sat watching the proceedings. For just a moment she saw the outline of someone who should not be there. The person was using camouflage technology, trying to stay invisible. Time seemed to slow down. Lisa saw the weapon being raised. She saw the targeting laser painting a red dot on Henry's chest. Without thinking, she threw herself at the ambassador, knocking him to the ground just as the first shot fired. The plasma bolt screamed through the air where Henry's head had been 1 second before. It hit the wall behind them, leaving a smoking hole in the metal. The conference hall exploded into chaos. Aliens screamed and ran for cover. Security alarms started blaring. More shots came from the gallery, each one a bolt of superheated plasma that could burn through armor. Lisa rolled with Henry behind the podium, her weapon already in her hand. She fired back at the attackers, her shots precise despite the confusion. 3 assassins became visible as their camouflage failed and they fell from the gallery, dead. But there was a 4th shooter that Lisa had not seen. As she pulled Henry toward the emergency exit, the plasma bolt hit him. Henry's eyes went wide with shock. He looked down at the smoking hole in his chest, then up at Lisa. She caught him as he fell, her hands pressing against the wound even though she knew there was no hope. Plasma burns at close range always killed. Henry grabbed Lisa's uniform with weak fingers. His voice was barely a whisper. He told her to make them pay. He told her that humanity could not let this stand. He told her that peace was worth fighting for, but only if both sides wanted peace. Then his hand fell away and the light left his eyes. The best diplomat humanity had ever produced was dead, murdered during peace talks on neutral ground. Station security finally arrived, but Lisa barely noticed them. She knelt beside Henry's body, her face showing no emotion now, but inside she was burning with cold fury. Around them, the conference hall had gone silent. The alien delegates stared at the scene in horror, all except one. Chancellor Vexler had not moved from his seat. His scaled face showed nothing. No surprise, no shock, no sadness. In that moment, Lisa understood the truth. This assassination had been planned. It had been approved. The sovereignty had murdered a diplomat during peace talks because they thought it would scare humanity into submission. They were wrong. They had just made the worst mistake in their 10,000-year history. They had shown humanity that talking would not work. They had shown that the sovereignty did not respect peace or diplomacy or basic decency. And now they were going to learn what happened when you pushed humans too far. Lisa looked at Henry's peaceful face one last time. Then she stood up and walked out of the conference hall. She had a message to deliver to Earth. A message that would change everything. The time for talking was over. The time for war had begun. 6 hours after Henry Blake died, the leaders of humanity gathered for an emergency meeting. They met in a secure bunker deep under the city of Geneva on Earth. The room was large and circular, with a big round table in the center. Around this table sat the most powerful people in human space. Some were there in person, while others appeared as holograms joining from Mars, the Moon, and distant colony worlds. President Eleanor Shaw sat at the head of the table. She was 65 years old with silver hair and sharp green eyes. For 20 years she had led humanity, guiding them through difficult times. She had seen economic problems, first contact with aliens, and the slow expansion into space. But nothing had prepared her for this moment. Standing beside her was Admiral Jack Morrison, the head of all human military forces. He was a tall man with broad shoulders and a chest full of medals from 40 years of service. Commander Lisa Martinez stood before the council to give her report. Her uniform was still stained with Henry's blood. Her hands shook slightly as she described what happened, but her voice stayed steady. She told them everything, from the first shot to Henry's last words. The security footage played on screens around the room, showing the assassination from multiple angles. Every person in the council watched in silence as their best diplomat was murdered. When Lisa finished, the room exploded with angry voices. Representatives from different colonies and worlds shouted over each other, demanding action. Some wanted immediate military strikes. Others called for economic sanctions. A few suggested trying diplomatic channels one more time. The argument grew louder and more heated until President Shaw raised her hand. The room went silent instantly. She spoke with a voice that was calm but filled with authority. She told them that what happened was not an accident or a mistake. It was a planned murder, an assassination designed to intimidate humanity. The sovereignty had broken every rule of civilized behavior. They had killed a diplomat on neutral ground during peace talks. This was not just an attack on one man, but an attack on everything humanity believed in. Admiral Morrison stepped forward and activated the tactical displays. Images of space filled the air above the table, showing star systems, fleet positions, and territorial boundaries. He explained the military situation with brutal honesty. The sovereignty had 47 member species. Their combined fleets numbered hundreds of thousands of ships. They controlled the richest, most populated region of the galaxy. Their military technology had been refined over thousands of years. Humanity, on the other hand, had been in space for only 300 years. The Terran Defense Fleet had 15,000 warships and 5,000 support vessels. Human territory consisted of 200 colony worlds spread across a relatively small area of space. By every logical measure, humanity should avoid war at all costs. Fighting the sovereignty would be like an ant fighting an elephant. But President Shaw's next words showed that humanity was not concerned with logic when it came to matters of honor and justice. She said they would not accept apologies. They would not accept money or territory as compensation. What happened was not something that could be fixed with negotiations. The sovereignty had shown their true nature. They had shown that they did not respect humanity or basic rules of decency. She called for a vote. Should humanity declare war on the galactic sovereignty? The room fell silent as each representative considered the question. They all knew what this meant. War against the sovereignty would cost millions of lives. Human worlds might be destroyed. Earth itself could be at risk. But they also knew that some things were worth fighting for, even if the fight seemed hopeless. The vote was unanimous. Every single representative voted yes. From Earth to the furthest colony, humanity spoke with one voice. They would go to war. Admiral Morrison took command immediately. His voice was sharp and clear as he gave orders. Messages went out to every military base, every ship, every soldier. Within minutes, the machinery of war began to move. Fleet Admiral Gregory Palmer, stationed at the shipyards above Mars, started preparing the Third Fleet for combat. General Nina Carter, training ground forces on the Moon, activated all reserve units and began deployment. President Shaw called Lisa Martinez forward. Despite the exhaustion and sadness on her face, Lisa's eyes burned with determination. The president promoted her to captain on the spot and gave her command of a special operations unit. Their mission was simple and direct. They would strike at sovereignty targets, hit them hard and fast, and show them that humanity would not be intimidated. Across human space, the response was incredible. On Earth, factories that made cars and computers switched to making weapons and ships. The giant shipyards floating in orbit around Mars, the Moon, and Saturn's moon Titan glowed with activity as workers rushed to complete half-finished vessels. Old ships that had been retired were brought back and updated with new weapons. The colony worlds responded with equal passion. New Houston, one of the largest colonies, suspended normal government operations to focus on the war effort. Mining colonies in the asteroid belt pushed their workers to maximum output, extracting the metals and minerals needed for ships and weapons. Research stations that had been studying peaceful things like medicine and agriculture suddenly focused on military technology. The human population reacted with remarkable unity. Old soldiers who had retired years ago went to recruitment centers to volunteer. Young men and women lined up to join the military, knowing they might die in this war. Scientists and engineers offered their knowledge to help build better weapons. Even ordinary civilians organized themselves into support groups, determined to help however they could. The sovereignty watched these preparations with amusement at first. They had seen this before from other young species. The species would make threats, build up their forces, and eventually realize they could not win. Then they would come back to negotiate, accepting whatever terms the sovereignty offered. It always happened this way. But what the sovereignty did not understand was that humans were different. Throughout human history, people had faced terrible dangers. They had survived ice ages, plagues, world wars, and environmental disasters. They had nearly destroyed themselves several times. But every time they had survived by refusing to give up, by fighting even when victory seemed impossible, by turning desperate situations into opportunities. The sovereignty had killed one diplomat thinking it would scare humanity. Instead, they had united every human in the galaxy behind a single cause. And that cause was simple and terrifying in its clarity. The sovereignty would pay for what they had done. They would learn that attacking humanity was the worst mistake they could make. They would learn that humans had a saying, a piece of wisdom passed down through generations. Never start a fight with someone who has nothing to lose, because humanity, pushed to the edge with their backs against the wall, was the most dangerous thing in the universe. They would fight with everything they had. They would sacrifice anything. They would never surrender. The age of peace was over. The age of war had begun, and the galaxy would never be the same. The ship called Valiant moved through the darkness of space like a hunting predator. Captain Lisa Martinez stood on the bridge, watching the tactical display that showed their target. It was a sovereignty military outpost floating in orbit around a dead moon. The station was large and heavily armed, with weapon arrays and shield generators that made it a powerful defensive position. Next to Lisa stood Lieutenant Commander Ryan Cooper. He was a young officer, only 29 years old, but he was brilliant with weapon systems. His fingers moved quickly across the controls as he prepared the ship's guns for battle. Behind them, the bridge crew worked quietly and efficiently. Every person knew their job and did it well. Lisa had personally chosen every member of her crew. They came from special forces units, experimental ship programs, and intelligence operations. Each one had volunteered for this mission, knowing it was extremely dangerous. They all understood what they were fighting for. They were fighting for Henry Blake, the murdered diplomat. They were fighting to show the sovereignty that humanity would not be pushed around. The Valiant was a special ship, unlike anything else in the human fleet. It had been built in secret over the past 10 years. Its armor could redistribute damage across the hull, making it harder to destroy. Its power core used advanced technology that provided almost unlimited energy. Its weapons included railguns that could fire metal slugs at incredible speeds, and plasma cannons that burned hotter than stars. But the Valiant's greatest weapon was its quantum drive. This special engine allowed the ship to fold space and appear anywhere almost instantly. It made the ship nearly impossible to track. The Sovereignty had no idea how human ships could suddenly appear out of nowhere, attack, and disappear before help could arrive. Lisa looked at the countdown timer. 30 seconds until the attack began. Around the Valiant, invisible in the darkness, 36 other human ships waited in position. Their stealth systems kept them hidden from enemy sensors. The Sovereignty station had no warning that death was coming. Lisa opened the communication channel to all ships in her fleet. Her voice was steady and calm as she spoke. She reminded them why they were there. She told them to remember Henry Blake, to remember that the Sovereignty thought they could murder with no consequences. She told them to show the galaxy what happened when you pushed humanity too far. The countdown reached 0. The Valiant's quantum drive activated. Space bent around them, and for a brief moment they existed in multiple places at once. Then they appeared less than 1 kilometer from the station, moving at full speed with all weapons ready. The Sovereignty station never had time to raise its shields. The Valiant's railguns fired first. Tungsten rods shot across space at tremendous speed. When they hit the station, each one released as much energy as a nuclear bomb. The rods punched through the hull like it was made of paper, causing explosions deep inside the station. Then the rest of Lisa's fleet appeared, all at once, in a carefully planned attack formation. Plasma cannons lit up the darkness, their superheated bolts burning through metal and equipment. Missiles launched from every ship, each one carrying enough explosive power to destroy a city block. The station tried to defend itself, but it had been designed to fight traditional battles. The human attack was too fast and too fierce. Enemy fighters scrambled from the station's hangar, but they flew right into a trap. Human interceptors, smaller and faster, tore through them. Pilot Kelly Grant led the fighter wing with incredible skill. She and her squadron destroyed the enemy fighters quickly and efficiently. The Sovereignty pilots had never faced anything like the aggressive, three-dimensional combat style that humans used. The entire battle lasted 17 minutes. When it ended, the Sovereignty outpost was nothing but floating debris. Lisa's fleet had suffered 0 casualties. Not one human ship had even taken serious damage. The victory was complete and overwhelming. But Lisa did not allow any celebration. She immediately ordered the fleet to move to their next target. Over the next week, they struck 6 more Sovereignty installations. Each attack followed the same pattern: appear without warning, destroy the defenses before they could respond properly, complete the mission, and vanish before enemy reinforcements arrived. The Sovereignty leadership was shocked and confused. For 10,000 years, they had been the greatest military power in the galaxy. Their fleets were huge and powerful. They had always won battles by using overwhelming force and superior numbers, but now they faced an enemy that refused to fight fair. The humans attacked from nowhere, struck hard, and disappeared before the Sovereignty could respond. What disturbed the Sovereignty even more was how effective human weapons were. Sovereignty technology had stayed mostly the same for thousands of years. They saw no reason to change or improve because their existing weapons and ships were already so powerful. But humans were different. Human technology improved with every generation. Humans constantly invented new things, tried new ideas, and pushed the boundaries of what was possible. Chancellor Vexillar called an emergency meeting of the Sovereignty Council. For the first time in his long life, he looked worried. The other alien leaders demanded to know how a primitive race was defeating their forces so easily. They wanted explanations for how humans could appear and disappear at will, how their weapons could pierce sovereignty shields and armor. Military intelligence officers gave their reports, and the information was disturbing. Humans did not think about war the same way other species did. Most races followed traditional tactics that had been proven over centuries. They valued predictability and careful planning. But humans embraced chaos. They constantly changed their tactics. They used surprise and speed as weapons. They attacked in ways that seemed crazy, but were actually carefully calculated. Even worse was a report from specialists who studied alien psychology. These experts had researched human history, looking at all the wars humanity had fought against themselves over thousands of years. Their conclusion was frightening. When humans went to war, they did not fight for limited goals. They fought for total victory. They would sacrifice anything, endure any suffering, and pay any price to win. Surrender was not in their nature. The sovereignty had expected this to be a short war. They thought a few demonstrations of their power would bring humanity to the negotiating table, willing to accept whatever terms were offered. Instead, they had awakened something terrible. They had given humanity a reason to fight without restraint, to use all their creative and destructive potential. On the Valiant, Lisa stood looking at star maps, planning the next series of attacks. Her crew worked around the clock, maintaining the ship and preparing for the next mission. They were tired but determined. Each successful attack boosted their confidence and proved that humanity could fight this war and win. Ryan Cooper approached with the latest intelligence reports. More targets had been identified. More sovereignty installations that needed to be destroyed. Lisa studied the information carefully, looking for patterns and weaknesses. She was not just fighting battles. She was developing a strategy that would bring the mighty sovereignty to its knees. The sovereignty had made a critical mistake. They had assumed that because they were old and powerful, they would always win. They had forgotten that age sometimes brings complacency, while youth brings innovation and desperate courage. They had forgotten that the most dangerous opponent is not the strongest, but the one with nothing to lose and everything to prove. Humanity was proving that lesson in blood and fire across the galaxy. 6 months into the war, everything had changed. What started as humanity's desperate fight for survival had become a real threat to the sovereignty's control over the galaxy. Admiral Jack Morrison stood in the Strategic Command Center on the Moon, surrounded by holographic displays showing the positions of military forces across dozens of star systems. The war had grown far beyond those first raids. Captain Lisa Martinez's task force, which had started operating alone, now worked with 5 other similar groups. Together they formed a network of fast attack units that could appear anywhere in sovereignty space with little warning. The quantum drives that made this possible remained humanity's biggest secret, and the sovereignty still had no idea how human ships moved so quickly. But the most important change came from an unexpected place. 3 months into the war, the first alien species left the sovereignty and joined humanity's side. They were called the Kellern, a species that lived in water and had been controlled by the Dravix for hundreds of years. When they saw humans fighting back successfully, they decided to take their chance at freedom. Their ships were not as advanced as human vessels, but they added important numbers to the growing alliance against the sovereignty. The Kellarn's decision started a chain reaction. Other species began questioning why they should remain loyal to the sovereignty. If humans could fight back, maybe they could too. The Praxis, a species of master engineers who had built many sovereignty installations, started providing information about defensive systems and weak points. Refugee groups from other conquered species offered intelligence about sovereignty politics and military structures. Admiral Morrison studied the latest reports with growing satisfaction. The sovereignty's huge advantage in numbers was shrinking. More and more species were either defecting to humanity or declaring neutrality and refusing to fight. The empire that had seemed so solid and permanent was starting to crack under pressure it had never experienced before. Meanwhile, human industry had reached levels of production that seemed impossible. Every colony world had transformed into a war factory. The shipyards orbiting Mars, the Moon, and Saturn's moon Titan were building new warships at an incredible rate. Construction times had been cut dramatically through new techniques and innovations that the sovereignty's rigid system could not match. Colonel Sandra Price, the head of military intelligence, walked into the command center holding a data tablet. Her expression told Morrison that she had important news. The Praxis engineers had finally provided what humanity had been waiting for. They had detailed plans of the sovereignty's central command station, the massive headquarters where Chancellor Vexillar controlled the entire empire. More importantly, they had found a critical weakness in its defenses. The station's shield generators were powerful, but operated on synchronized frequencies. With precisely timed electromagnetic pulses, those shields could be disrupted for a few crucial seconds. That would be enough time for human weapons to penetrate the station's defenses. Morrison immediately understood what this meant. A successful attack on the command station would not just be a military victory. It would prove to every species in the galaxy that the sovereignty could be beaten. The planning took 3 days of constant work. Every detail was examined. Every possible problem was considered. Captain Martinez's task force would lead the attack, but they would have support from major fleet elements. Nearly 1/3 of humanity's total military strength would be committed to this single operation. It was an enormous risk, but the potential reward was worth it. The Kellarn contributed 12 of their heavy cruisers. These ships were built for long battles rather than quick raids, and they would be crucial for the sustained fighting that this operation would require. The Praxis sent technical specialists who would coordinate the shield disruption. Even species that had officially declared neutrality secretly provided information and supplies, hoping for the sovereignty's defeat, but unwilling to openly support humanity. President Eleanor Shaw addressed all the fleet commanders through a secure holographic conference. Her message was clear and direct. They were not fighting for conquest or revenge. They were fighting to ensure that no diplomat would ever be murdered during peace talks again. They were fighting so that no species would have to bow before tyrants just because those tyrants were powerful. This was a fight for justice and freedom. The fleet gathered at a secret location in empty space between star systems. Ships that had been scattered across human territory came together in one massive force. Lisa Martinez watched from the Valiant's bridge as hundreds of vessels appeared around them. Their lights created a beautiful constellation in the darkness, a symbol of humanity's determination and courage. Lieutenant Commander Ryan Cooper ran final checks on all weapons systems. The crew made last-minute preparations, checking equipment and reviewing battle plans. The mood on the bridge was tense but focused. Everyone understood that this operation would determine not just the outcome of the war, but possibly the future of the entire galaxy. Throughout human space, civilians gathered around screens to watch news about the fleet's departure. They knew their family members and friends were heading into the most dangerous battle of the war, but they also knew that humanity had never backed down from a challenge. Humans had always refused to surrender to tyranny. They had always believed that some things were worth fighting for. No matter how difficult the fight might be, in the grand halls of sovereignty power, Chancellor Vexillar received reports about human fleet movements. His military advisors warned that this looked like a major operation, possibly targeting a core system. But Vexillar dismissed their concerns with arrogant confidence. Let the humans come, he told them. Let them attack and be destroyed. Then this annoying rebellion would finally be crushed, and the galaxy would return to proper order. What Vexillar failed to understand was that humanity's greatest strength was not their technology or tactics. It was their absolute refusal to accept defeat. It was their ability to adapt and overcome any obstacle. It was their capacity to unite completely when facing an existential threat. The sovereignty had ruled through fear and overwhelming force for 10,000 years. But they had never faced a species that simply did not know how to quit. On the Valiant, Lisa looked at her crew one more time before the operation began. These people had become her family over the months of constant combat. They had fought together, bled together, and survived together. Now they would face the greatest challenge yet. But she had complete faith in them. They were the best humanity had to offer, and they would not fail. The countdown began. In minutes, they would jump to the sovereignty's home system. They would attack the heart of an empire that had stood for 10,000 years. The odds were against them, as they had been from the beginning. But humans had learned long ago that odds were just numbers. What mattered was courage, determination, and the willingness to fight for what was right. The sovereignty was about to receive a hard lesson that human history had taught countless times. The most dangerous enemy is not the strongest or the biggest. The most dangerous enemy is the one with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for, and humanity was exactly that kind of enemy. The battle that would change galactic history forever began when Captain Lisa Martinez's fleet emerged from Quantum Fold near the Sovereignty's command station. Hundreds of human ships appeared all at once, exactly where they needed to be. Their weapons were already charging, ready to fire the instant they arrived. The Sovereignty defense fleet reacted quickly, but they had positioned their ships to defend against traditional attacks. The humans had appeared from above, coming from an angle that the station's defensive weapons were not designed to cover well. It was a small advantage, but Lisa planned to use every edge they had. The Praxis technical specialists activated their electromagnetic pulse generators right on schedule. Waves of carefully tuned energy washed over the command station. For exactly 3 seconds, the station's powerful shields flickered and died. In those 3 seconds, humanity struck with overwhelming force. Railgun projectiles traveling at incredible speeds punched through the station's armor like it was nothing. Plasma cannons burned through structural supports. Laser arrays cut through defensive installations with surgical precision. The station's defense systems tried to respond, but they had been built to handle attacks from a few capital ships, not a coordinated assault from hundreds of vessels attacking as one unified force. The Sovereignty defense fleet rushed to protect their command station. Their massive warships, each one larger than 10 human vessels, moved into defensive positions. But the Kellern heavy cruisers intercepted them. The alien species that had suffered under Sovereignty rule for centuries was eager to strike back. Their crews fought with passion and determination, holding back the enemy fleet while human ships focused on the station. Lisa guided the Valiant through the chaos with deadly accuracy. Lieutenant Commander Ryan Cooper and his weapons crew worked with perfect efficiency. Their targeting computers tracked and eliminated threats with ruthless precision. Around them, the bridge crew performed their duties with the calm professionalism that came from months of constant combat. They had trained for this moment, and now they executed their mission flawlessly. Inside the command station, Chancellor Vexlar watched his empire falling apart. His strategic displays showed red warning indicators spreading across the system like a disease. His fleets, so carefully positioned and numerically superior, were being systematically defeated by an enemy that refused to fight the way wars had been fought for thousands of years. The explosions rocked the station as human weapons tore through deck after deck. Power failures spread through critical systems. Life support began failing in some sections. The command center itself shook from nearby impacts. For the first time in his long life, Vexlar felt something he had never experienced before: fear. Then something unexpected happened. A group of Sovereignty officers, seeing the destruction and understanding that continued fighting would only cause more death, made a decision. They arrested Chancellor Vexlar right there in his command chamber. The old dictator who had ordered so much suffering and oppression was taken into custody without resistance. The officers immediately broadcast a ceasefire order to all Sovereignty forces. The battle ended suddenly. Sovereignty ships powered down their weapons and pulled back to defensive positions. Human forces stopped firing but remained ready for any tricks. After 18 months of brutal warfare, the guns finally went silent. The war was over. 3 weeks later, the peace conference began. It was held on a new station that had been built specifically for this purpose. Security was absolute, provided by both human and reformed Sovereignty forces working together. No one wanted another assassination. No one wanted to repeat the tragedy that had started this entire war. President Eleanor Shaw led the human delegation, with Captain Martinez standing beside her. Across the conference table sat representatives from 47 species, including the new Sovereignty leadership. The Draviks had been removed from power. They were replaced by a council of different species that promised genuine equality and cooperation. The negotiations took months, but eventually they created a treaty that changed galactic civilization. The old Sovereignty was dissolved completely. In its place came a federation where all species were equal partners. No single race could dominate the others. Trade routes were open to everyone. Technology would be shared freely. Most importantly, strict new rules were established to protect diplomats and ensure that peace talks would always be safe. The station where Ambassador Henry Blake had been murdered was transformed into a memorial. It became a training center for diplomats from all species. A statue of Blake was placed in the central plaza, a permanent reminder of the cost of tyranny and the importance of protecting those who worked for peace. Captain Martinez, promoted to admiral for her critical role in winning the war, stood before that statue on the anniversary of Blake's death. She thought about his final words, his belief that peace was worth fighting for, and his hope that humanity could make the galaxy better. The war had been costly for humanity. Hundreds of thousands of people had died. Dozens of colony worlds bore scars from sovereignty attacks. Many families had lost loved ones. But humanity had achieved something remarkable. They had stood against an empire that had ruled for 10,000 years and won, not through conquest, but through their unwillingness to accept injustice. The galaxy learned important lessons from this war. They learned that humanity should never be underestimated. They learned that old technology and old tactics would always lose to innovation and adaptation. They learned that tyranny, no matter how ancient or powerful, would eventually fall when people refused to accept it. The new Federation flourished in the years that followed. Trade expanded across the galaxy. Technology advanced rapidly as species shared knowledge freely. Conflicts were resolved through dialogue rather than warfare. Humanity took its place not as conquerors, but as equals among the stars. Admiral Jack Morrison, now retired from active service, became a teacher at the new Galactic Military Academy. He taught tactics and strategy to students from dozens of different species. His favorite lessons were about the war with the sovereignty, showing how a smaller force had defeated a much larger one through superior thinking, innovation, and absolute determination. President Shaw served 2 more terms before retiring to write her memoirs. Her book about the war years became required reading for anyone studying politics or history. She emphasized that peace was not simply the absence of conflict. Real peace required justice. When justice was denied, when tyrants ruled, when diplomats were murdered, then war became not just acceptable but necessary. The Valiant and the other ships from Martinez's original task force were preserved as museums. Young beings from every species visited them. Walking the same corridors where human warriors had fought for freedom, they sat in the same seats where crews had worked during desperate battles. They learned about the war that changed everything. Years passed. Admiral Martinez grew old. Her hair turned gray and her body showed the effects of a lifetime of military service, but her eyes still held the same fire that had burned during those battles long ago. On the 50th anniversary of Henry Blake's assassination, she returned to the memorial station one final time. She stood before Blake's statue, holding a data tablet that contained his final words. She had never shared those words with anyone before. But now, with a crowd of humans and aliens gathered to honor the fallen diplomat, she read them aloud. Her voice carried clearly through the memorial's speakers. Blake's message had been simple but powerful. He had asked Martinez to remember that peace was always worth fighting for. He had said that justice was worth any price. He had reminded her that humanity's greatest strength was not weapons or technology, but compassion, combined with the refusal to accept tyranny. He had asked her to build a better galaxy in his memory. As Martinez finished reading, she looked at the crowd around her. Humans stood beside Kellarn. Praxis worked with former sovereignty species. Children from a dozen races played together in the plaza. This was the galaxy Blake had imagined. This was the legacy of a war that should never have been necessary, but had created something beautiful from tragedy. The galaxy would always remember. Remember that one diplomat's assassination had started a war. Remember that the war had ended an age of tyranny. Remember that humans, when pushed too far, had stood up and said no more. Remember Ambassador Henry Blake and the price of peace. 25 years after the war ended, the galaxy was a completely different place. The change was visible everywhere, from the busiest trade stations to the quietest colony worlds. Species that had once feared each other now worked together. Technology that had been kept secret for millennia was now shared openly. The old ways of empire and domination had been replaced by cooperation and mutual respect. On Earth, in the city of New York, a young woman named Kate Harper sat in her classroom at the university. She was studying galactic history, learning about the events that had shaped the modern Federation. Today's lesson was about the Sovereignty War, as it was now called. Her professor, An elderly Keller named Selvik moved his tentacles gracefully as he spoke about those dramatic days. Selvik had fought in that war. He had been a young officer on one of the Kellarn cruisers that joined the human fleet. He remembered the fear and the hope, the terrible battles and the final victory. Now he taught the next generation about those events, making sure they understood both the cost and the importance of what had happened. Kate listened carefully as Selvik described the assassination of Ambassador Blake. She had read about it in textbooks, but hearing it from someone who had lived through that time made it more real. She understood now why the memorial station existed, why every diplomatic student had to visit it, why the galaxy could never forget what had happened. After class, Kate walked through the university campus. It was a beautiful place with buildings from Earth mixed with architectural styles from dozens of alien cultures. Students from many species studied together, learned together, and became friends. This diversity would have been impossible before the war. The old sovereignty would never have allowed such free mixing of species. Kate's roommate was a young praxis named Tellin. They had become close friends over the past 2 years. Tellin's grandfather had been one of the engineers who provided the intelligence that allowed humanity to strike at the Sovereignty Command Station. The family was proud of that contribution to freedom, though it had put them in great danger at the time. That evening, Kate and Tellin attended a lecture by Admiral Lisa Martinez. The famous warrior was now 73 years old, but she still traveled across the galaxy giving talks about the war and its lessons. The auditorium was packed with students, professors, and citizens who wanted to hear her speak. Martinez walked onto the stage slowly. Her body showed her age, but her eyes remained sharp and clear. She stood at the podium and looked out at the audience for a long moment before speaking. When she did, her voice was strong and steady. She did not talk about tactics or battles at first. Instead, she talked about why the war had been necessary. She explained that the Sovereignty War was not really about territory or resources. It was about principles. It was about the idea that some things were more important than survival. Dignity was one of those things. Justice was another. The right to be treated with respect. The right to have your voice heard. The right to live free from tyranny. These rights were worth fighting for, even when the fight seemed impossible to win. Martinez talked about Henry Blake, the man whose death had started everything. She described him not as a hero or a martyr, but as a dedicated public servant who believed in peace. He had spent his life trying to build bridges between species, trying to solve problems through dialogue instead of violence. His murder had been a crime not just against humanity, but against the very idea of civilization. Then Martinez talked about the war itself. She was honest about the mistakes made, the opportunities missed, the lives lost unnecessarily. War was never clean or simple, she explained. It was always messy and terrible. But sometimes it was necessary. Sometimes peaceful people had to become warriors to protect what mattered most. She described the battle at the Sovereignty Command Station in vivid detail. Kate found herself holding her breath as Martinez recounted those desperate moments when the outcome could have gone either way. The Admiral talked about the fear she felt, the responsibility of commanding so many lives, and the relief when the sovereignty forces finally surrendered. After the lecture, students lined up to ask questions. Kate waited her turn, thinking carefully about what she wanted to ask. When she finally reached the front, she looked at the famous Admiral and asked a question that had been bothering her. How did humanity find the courage to fight when they were so outnumbered? How did they keep going when victory seemed impossible? Martinez smiled at the question. She said that courage was not about being unafraid. Courage was about being terrified but doing what needed to be done anyway. Every person in the human fleet had been scared. They knew the odds were against them. They knew they might die, but they also knew that some things were worth dying for. Freedom was one of those things. Justice was another. The belief that a better future was possible, that was worth any sacrifice. She explained that humanity had an advantage the sovereignty did not expect. Humans were adaptable. When one approach failed, they tried another. When traditional tactics did not work, they invented new ones. The sovereignty had been stuck in old patterns for thousands of years. They could not imagine doing things differently. But humans thrived on change and innovation. Kate thanked the Admiral and returned to her seat, thinking about what she had heard. That night she could not sleep. She kept thinking about the war. about the people who had fought and died, about the galaxy they had created through their sacrifice. She decided then that she would become a diplomat, following in Henry Blake's footsteps. She would work to maintain the peace that so many had fought to achieve. Across the galaxy, millions of young beings were making similar decisions. The war had taught them that peace was precious but fragile. It had to be protected, nurtured, and fought for when necessary. The new Federation was not perfect. There were still conflicts and disagreements, but now these problems were solved through dialogue and compromise rather than violence and domination. The Dravik species, once the rulers of the sovereignty, had been humbled by their defeat. Many of them had learned valuable lessons about humility and cooperation. They contributed their knowledge and experience to the Federation, working alongside species they had once oppressed. Not all Draviks accepted the new order, but most recognized that the old ways had led only to war and suffering. Former Chancellor Vexlar spent his remaining years in comfortable confinement on a remote world. He was not treated cruelly, as that would have violated the principles the Federation stood for. But he was never allowed to hold power again. Sometimes he gave interviews to historians, and in his final years he admitted that the assassination of Henry Blake had been the greatest mistake of his long life. The quantum drive technology that had given humanity such an advantage in the war was eventually shared with other species. President Shaw had insisted on this, arguing that hoarding such technology would repeat the mistakes of the old sovereignty. Some military leaders disagreed, but Shaw's vision prevailed. The result was a new era of exploration and expansion, as species used the technology to reach previously unreachable parts of the galaxy. Admiral Martinez lived to be 92 years old. She spent her final years at the Memorial Station, serving as its director. She ensured that every diplomat who trained there understood the history, the sacrifice, and the responsibility that came with their role. When she died peacefully in her sleep, representatives from every species in the Federation attended her funeral. She was buried on Earth with full military honors, her casket draped with the flags of both humanity and the Federation. The galaxy continued to change and grow. New species were discovered and welcomed into the Federation. Old conflicts were resolved through the new diplomatic frameworks. Trade flourished. Art and culture were exchanged freely. The dark age of empire and oppression had ended, replaced by an era of cooperation and shared prosperity. But the lessons of the Sovereignty War were never forgotten. Every year on the anniversary of Henry Blake's death, ceremonies were held across the galaxy. Children learned about the war in schools. Diplomats studied its lessons. Military academies analyzed its battles. The memory was kept alive not to glorify war, but to remember why it had been necessary and to prevent such conflicts in the future. Kate Harper eventually became a respected diplomat herself, negotiating treaties and resolving disputes between species. She always carried a small hologram of Henry Blake, a reminder of the man who had died so that others could live in peace. Whenever negotiations became difficult, whenever she felt like giving up, she would look at that hologram and remember why her work mattered. The galaxy that Henry Blake had dreamed of, the one he had worked his entire life to create, had finally become real. It was not perfect. There were still challenges and problems. But it was a galaxy where justice mattered, where diplomats were protected, where different species could work together as equals. It was a galaxy worth fighting for. It was a galaxy worth dying for. And it was a galaxy that would endure, built on the sacrifice of those who refused to accept tyranny and the courage of those who dared to imagine something better.